Victor Hale was a man the world respected, feared, and envied. He was the CEO of one of the largest corporations in the country, a billionaire whose name stood for power. People spoke of his sharp mind, his ruthless business sense, and his unmatched wealth. But behind the polished walls of his empire, Victor Hale lived in silence, cut off from the world, cut off from people, and cut off from love. For decades, his life had been reduced to numbers, contracts, and endless meetings. He had everything that money could buy: cars, mansions, private jets, but nothing that truly mattered. When he returned to his mansion each night, no one waited for him. The vast halls were quiet, the long dining table empty, and the air heavy with loneliness. Once, many years ago, Victor had believed in love. He had planned a future with the woman he adored. But she had left him for another man, someone who wanted his money, not his heart. That betrayal burned deep, leaving scars that never healed. Since then, Victor chose solitude. He decided no one would ever be close enough to hurt him again. Now, at 55, Victor looked older than his age. His hair was streaked with silver, his face marked with lines from years of stress and silence. He kept people at a distance. Even his employees knew better than to joke or smile in his presence. "Mr. Hale is all business," they whispered. "He doesn't feel. He doesn't forgive." But what no one knew was that Victor's mansion at night told the real story. The billionaire often sat alone by the window, staring at the city lights far below, his glass of whiskey untouched. Sometimes he opened a photo album, where a younger version of himself smiled beside the woman who betrayed him. He would close it quickly, ashamed that even after decades, the pain still haunted him. Victor's assistants never lasted long. Most were too scared of him, or too eager to impress him. Some tried to gain his trust only to ask for favors or money later. Each time, his walls grew taller, his heart colder. But time has a strange way of changing lives. One quiet morning, his senior manager entered his office with news. "Mr. Hale," the manager said nervously, "we've hired you a new personal secretary. She starts today." Victor frowned. "Another one?" His tone was sharp, filled with irritation. "How long will this one last?" "A week." The manager swallowed hard. "She's different, sir. Her name is Clara Evans. I think you should meet her yourself." Victor waved his hand dismissively, but a part of him was curious. He leaned back in his leather chair, his cold eyes narrowing. "Send her in." The door opened, and in walked Clara Evans. She was not what Victor expected. She didn't wear flashy clothes or heavy jewelry like others who tried to impress him. She wore a simple blouse and skirt, her hair neatly tied back. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance, yet something about her calmness filled the room. Clara stood straight, her hands holding a folder, her voice steady. "Good morning, Mr. Hale. It's an honor to work with you. I'm here to assist you in any way you need." Victor studied her carefully. Most new secretaries trembled under his gaze, but Clara didn't. She wasn't smiling too much to please him, nor was she shaking with fear. She was simply steady. He tested her immediately. "You'll find working with me is not easy. I don't tolerate mistakes." Clara nodded politely. "I understand, sir. I will do my best." Something about her tone bothered him. It wasn't arrogance, and it wasn't submission. It was quiet confidence. Victor turned away, hiding his irritation. He didn't want anyone in his space, especially not someone who might try to get close. That night, when Victor returned to his lonely mansion, he thought briefly of Clara Evans. He didn't know why. She was just another secretary, and she would probably leave soon like the others. Yet, in the silence of his empty dining hall, her calm voice echoed in his mind, "I will do my best." Victor Hale had no idea that this simple woman, this secretary, would awaken something he thought was dead inside him. She would challenge his walls, disturb his silence, and change the empire he had built around his loneliness. But for now, he poured himself another glass of whiskey, staring out the window into the night. He didn't believe in second chances. He didn't believe in trust. And above all, he didn't believe in love. At least, not yet. The next morning, Victor Hale arrived at his office as usual, early, precise, and silent. His routine had been the same for years: step into the elevator without a word, walk straight into his office, and bury himself in files before anyone dared disturb him. But this morning felt different. When he pushed open the tall glass doors of his office, Clara Evans was already there. She stood by his desk, arranging documents neatly into folders. A small vase with fresh flowers sat beside the stack, something no one had dared place on Victor's desk before. His brows furrowed. "Who told you to bring those?" His voice was cold. Clara turned, calm as ever. "No one, sir. I just thought a little freshness might help after long meetings. If you don't like them, I'll remove them." Victor stared at her for a long moment. Most people would panic, rushing to apologize, but Clara simply waited, her expression steady. Finally, he said, "Leave them." He moved past her, hiding his surprise. The morning went on. Victor dictated letters, reviewed contracts, and demanded reports. Clara kept pace with him easily. She wrote quickly, without hesitation, and anticipated his needs before he even spoke. When he reached for a file, it was already in her hands. When he frowned at a missing number, she quietly corrected it. For a man used to snapping at assistants for their mistakes, Victor found himself strangely silent. Around noon, he noticed Clara hadn't left her desk once. She typed continuously, her eyes focused. "Don't you need a break?" he asked sharply. Clara looked up. "I'll eat later, sir. This work is important." Victor narrowed his eyes. He recognized the hunger in her gaze, not for money, but for responsibility. She wasn't like the others who begged for his approval or tried to charm him. She simply worked, and she worked well. By the end of the day, Victor felt unsettled. He told himself it was nothing, but a thought kept returning, maybe this secretary was different. The following week only proved it. Clara arrived before him every morning and left after him every night. She didn't complain, didn't gossip, and didn't ask for favors. She carried herself with quiet dignity, as if her value came from her work, not from his wealth. One evening, Victor called her into his office. "Why do you work so hard?" he asked. "Do you want a promotion? A raise?" Clara shook her head gently. "I work hard because I believe every job deserves respect. My father used to say, 'Do your work like it matters, because it does.'" Her words caught Victor off guard. No one had spoken to him like that in years. Most people wanted something, money, status, power. But Clara spoke as if she carried her own principles, and nothing could shake them. He studied her closely. "You know who I am, don't you? People would do anything to be close to me." Clara met his gaze without fear. "Yes, I know who you are. But I'm here to do my job, not to chase your name." Victor fell silent. It had been decades since anyone dared say something so plain to him. There was no flattery, no hidden agenda, only honesty. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside his guarded heart. Still, he refused to show it. "You may leave," he said coldly. Clara nodded, gathering her notes, and quietly stepped out of the room. That night, Victor sat by his window as always, staring at the glowing city. But the silence around him felt different. He poured his drink, but instead of thinking about old betrayals, his mind replayed Clara's words, "I'm here to do my job, not to chase your name." Something about her unsettled him. She was not trying to break into his empire or steal his trust. She simply existed, strong in her own way, unaffected by his coldness. And that terrified him more than betrayal ever had. Because for the first time in decades, Victor Hale felt the faint stir of curiosity. A tiny spark, buried under years of bitterness, flickered in his chest. He told himself it was nothing. Just a secretary. Just another employee. But deep down, Victor knew, something was beginning. And he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Days turned into weeks, and Clara Evans settled into her role as Victor Hale's secretary with quiet determination. She never asked personal questions, never overstepped her boundaries, and yet, somehow, her presence began to touch corners of Victor's life he thought were locked forever. Victor had always believed that people worked for him out of fear or greed. But Clara was different. She worked as if she respected herself first, and then her job. She wasn't afraid of his cold tone or sharp orders. She carried herself with calm grace, and it disturbed Victor more than he cared to admit. One afternoon, during a long meeting with his board, Victor grew impatient. The discussion dragged endlessly, filled with numbers and strategies he already knew. He slammed his hand on the table. Enough. We'll finalize this later. His voice echoed across the room, leaving everyone pale and silent. When Victor stormed out, Clara followed quietly, holding a folder. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, "I've organized the main points of the meeting. If you review just these pages, you won't waste more time." Victor paused, taking the folder. He flipped through it quickly. She had condensed hours of endless talk into 3 clean pages. His eyes narrowed. "You did this during the meeting?" "Yes, sir," Clara replied calmly. "You seemed restless. I thought this might help." Victor studied her. No assistant had ever dared to anticipate his thoughts like this before. He felt a strange warmth in his chest, something close to gratitude. But he crushed it down quickly. "Good," he said coldly, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. That evening, when Victor returned home, he found himself thinking about Clara again. He remembered the way she had quietly watched him during the meeting, not with fear, but with understanding. It was as though she could see the weight he carried. For the first time in years, Victor didn't sit in silence. He walked into his study and pulled out the old piano in the corner, its keys covered in dust. He hadn't played since his youth, back when music had been his escape. His fingers hovered over the keys, and slowly, a soft melody filled the empty room. He stopped abruptly, startled by himself. Why now? Why tonight? The answer unsettled him. Clara's presence had shaken something loose inside him. The next morning, Clara noticed the change. Victor's questions grew less sharp, his instructions less impatient. He still carried the aura of a powerful man, but every now and then, a flicker of softness passed through his eyes. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled outside, Clara entered his office to find Victor staring out the window. His usual pile of documents lay untouched. "Sir," she asked gently, "are you unwell?" Victor turned, surprised by the concern in her voice. For a moment, he considered brushing her off. But something inside pushed him to speak. "Do you ever wonder," he said slowly, "what all of this is for? The meetings, the money, the empire." He gestured toward the towering skyscrapers outside. Clara hesitated, then replied, "I think it's for what we choose to make it for, sir. For some, it's power. For others, maybe security. But if it doesn't give peace, then maybe it's not worth much." Her words struck Victor like lightning. He turned back to the window, hiding the emotion that threatened to rise. No one in years had dared speak to him in such human terms. Everyone else saw him as a machine for money. Clara saw him as a man. That night, the silence in his mansion felt heavier than usual. He sat in his study, staring at the piano again. He wanted to play, but his hands trembled. Instead, he poured himself a drink, though it did nothing to calm the storm inside him. For decades, Victor Hale had built walls around his heart, higher and stronger with every betrayal and disappointment. But now, without even trying, Clara Evans was leaving cracks in those walls. And through those cracks, feelings Victor thought were dead began to creep back, feelings of warmth, curiosity, and perhaps even longing. Victor didn't like it. He didn't trust it. But he couldn't deny it. For the first time in decades, the lonely billionaire found himself wondering not about his next deal or his next profit, but about a woman who sat outside his office, calmly working, completely unaware of the storm she was creating inside his heart. Clara Evans had worked for Victor Hale for 2 months now, and though she never asked about his personal life, she had begun to notice the shadows that followed him. She noticed the way his eyes sometimes lingered on old photographs hidden in his office drawer. She noticed how his mood shifted when younger couples walked past during company events. And she noticed the emptiness in his mansion whenever she delivered files there after hours. It was the kind of loneliness that couldn't be hidden behind money or power. One evening, Clara stayed late to finish paperwork. The rain tapped against the tall windows as she typed quietly. When she looked up, she realized Victor was still in his office, sitting motionless at his desk. His hands rested on an old leather folder, but he wasn't reading it. He was staring at it as though it carried a weight too heavy to bear. Clara hesitated, then knocked softly on the doorframe. "Mr. Hale. It's very late. Should I call the driver for you?" Victor looked up, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he would brush her off. But then, to her surprise, he pushed the folder toward her. "Do you want to know why I live the way I do?" he asked. His voice was quiet, almost fragile. Clara froze. She hadn't expected such a question. "Only if you want to tell me, sir," she said gently. Victor leaned back, his eyes distant. "Years ago, I was engaged. I thought I had found love. She was beautiful, charming, everything a man could dream of. I trusted her completely. I built this empire with her by my side, or so I believed." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But then I discovered the truth. She never loved me. She loved what I could give her, money, power, a name. When a richer investor came along, she left without hesitation. I was nothing more than a stepping stone to her. That day, I buried my heart. I told myself never again." Clara listened silently, her chest tightening at the raw pain in his voice. She could see it wasn't just anger, it was a wound that had never healed. Victor's voice grew colder. "People call me ruthless. They say I'm impossible to work for. They don't understand. Ruthlessness is easier than weakness. If I don't let anyone close, they can't hurt me again." The room fell into silence. The sound of the rain outside filled the space between them. Finally, Clara spoke softly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hale. No one deserves to be treated like that." Victor's eyes flickered toward her. He expected pity, maybe judgment. But Clara's gaze held neither. There was only quiet understanding. "Pain can make us build walls," she continued, "but walls also keep out the light. Not everyone is the same. Some people care for reasons that have nothing to do with wealth or power." Victor studied her carefully. She spoke with such sincerity, as if she believed every word. For the first time in years, he didn't feel mocked or judged. He felt heard. But fear quickly rose inside him. He leaned back, his tone sharp again. "Words are easy, Miss Evans. People always sound sincere until the mask falls." Clara didn't flinch. "Maybe so. But some people live without masks. You just haven't met enough of them yet." Her calmness unsettled him. He wanted to dismiss her words, to laugh at her optimism. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered that she might be right. That night, Victor couldn't sleep. He sat at his piano again, his fingers pressing a melody he hadn't played since his youth. Each note carried the weight of his memories, the betrayal, the loneliness, and now, Clara's quiet voice telling him not all people wore masks. For years, Victor Hale had hidden his pain behind power. But tonight, the pain felt exposed, raw, and alive again. And strangely, it didn't crush him. Because for the first time in decades, someone else had seen it, and hadn't walked away. Victor didn't know what to make of this secretary who worked in his shadow, who dared to see the man behind the empire. But one thing was certain, Clara Evans was no ordinary employee. She was becoming a mirror he never asked for, reflecting the truth he had tried so hard to bury. And that truth terrified him more than betrayal ever had. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Victor Hale had experienced in decades. His mansion, once silent as a tomb, began to feel less empty. Not because it was filled with guests or noise, but because Clara's quiet presence lingered in his mind even after she left work. At the office, she continued her duties with the same calm discipline. But there were small moments that Victor could no longer ignore. One afternoon, when he snapped at an employee for a late report, Clara placed the corrected file on his desk before he could explode further. "The figures were delayed, sir, but the work is solid. You might want to give them credit instead of anger." Victor had stared at her, speechless. No one had ever dared to correct him. Yet, strangely, he didn't feel rage. He felt respect. Another day, during lunch, Clara entered with a tray of food. "You've skipped 2 meals already," she said simply. "I thought you might need this." Victor frowned. "I don't need a babysitter." Clara only shrugged. "Everyone needs to eat, even billionaires." She placed the tray down and left without waiting for thanks. That evening, Victor found himself eating every bite. Slowly, her small acts of care began to melt the ice he had lived in for years. He found himself looking forward to her presence, to the sound of her voice explaining schedules, to the way she never flinched at his coldness. She treated him not as a billionaire, not as a feared CEO, but simply as a man. It stirred something long buried inside him, a warmth he had almost forgotten existed. But with warmth came fear. One night, Victor attended a grand charity gala. He usually despised such events, full of false smiles and greedy eyes. Clara attended too, handling his schedules. She wore a simple black dress, elegant but modest. Yet when she walked across the hall, Victor felt every eye turn toward her, and for the first time, jealousy burned in his chest. Throughout the night, several men tried to speak with her. Clara answered politely but returned to her duties. Still, Victor couldn't ignore the tightness in his chest. He realized, with shock, that he didn't want anyone else near her. Later, when the gala ended, whispers reached his ears. A pair of board members chuckled as they watched Clara leave with her files. "Smart girl," one sneered quietly. "She'll charm her way into the old man's fortune soon enough." Victor froze. Their words cut deep, dragging up memories of betrayal. His heart wavered between trust and suspicion. Could Clara truly be different? Or was she playing the same game others had played before? The next morning, Victor was colder than usual. He gave Clara impossible tasks, watching carefully for cracks in her patience. But she worked tirelessly, never complaining, never asking for favors. At one point, she looked at him directly and asked, "Did I do something wrong, sir?" Victor's throat tightened. For a long moment, he almost confessed his fear. Instead, he said, "No. Continue your work." Clara nodded, her expression unreadable, and returned to her desk. That night, Victor sat in his empty mansion again. His walls were trembling. On one side stood the warmth Clara brought, the laughter she unknowingly awakened. On the other stood the ghosts of his past, whispering that trust only leads to heartbreak. He sat at the piano, his fingers pressing out a melody soft and aching. For the first time in years, tears threatened his eyes. Was he falling for her? The thought terrified him. Desire was dangerous. Trust was dangerous. But his heart, his lonely, starved heart, was awakening, and there was no stopping it. The awakening was not gentle. It was fire. It was longing. It was fear. Victor Hale, the man who had sworn to live in solitude, was standing at the edge of something he thought he would never feel again. And though he tried to fight it, he knew the truth. Clara Evans had awakened not just his desire, but his very soul. Victor Hale had built his empire on control, control over his company, his employees, his wealth, and most of all, over his heart. But ever since Clara Evans walked into his office, that control had been slipping away. The whispers at the gala haunted him. "She'll charm her way into the old man's fortune." Those cruel words echoed at night, reminding him of the betrayal that once destroyed him. And yet, when he looked at Clara, he couldn't see deception. He saw honesty. He saw dignity. He saw someone who worked not for money, but because she believed in respect. But fear is a powerful enemy. One morning, Victor decided to test her. He called Clara into his office. His tone was sharp, his face unreadable. "I've decided to give you a bonus," he said, sliding an envelope across the desk. "Inside is more money than your yearly salary. Consider it a reward for your loyalty." Clara glanced at the envelope, then back at him. Her expression did not change. "I can't accept this, Mr. Hale." Victor's brow furrowed. "Why not? Don't you want it? Isn't this why you stayed?" Clara shook her head firmly. "I stayed because I respect the work, and because I believe in honesty. I'm not here for your money. If you don't see that by now, then perhaps I should leave." The room fell silent. Victor's chest tightened. For a moment, he feared she would actually walk out. And the thought of losing her was unbearable. "Clara," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the mask of coldness. "Wait." She stopped, turning slowly. For the first time, Victor looked at her not as an employee, not as a secretary, but as the woman who had changed his life. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "For years, I buried myself in walls of stone. I told myself love was a weakness. I convinced myself that money was enough. But since you came here, I feel alive again. And it terrifies me. Clara's eyes softened. She stepped closer, her voice gentle. Fear only has power if you let it control you. You've lived in solitude because of one person's betrayal. But not everyone is the same, Victor. Some people care for who you are, not for what you own. Her words struck his heart like light breaking through darkness. For decades, he had believed no one could see the man behind the empire. But Clara did. Slowly, he reached out his hand. It trembled, not from weakness, but from emotion. I don't want to live like this anymore. I don't want an empire without warmth. Clara, I want you by my side. Not as my secretary, but as the woman who awakened me. Tears glistened in Clara's eyes, but she smiled softly. Then let me stay, not as an employee, but as someone who believes in you. Not your wealth. You. For a long moment, silence filled the room. And then, for the first time in decades, Victor Hale allowed himself to smile, a true, unguarded smile. That evening, the mansion no longer felt empty. Clara joined him for dinner at the long table that had once been a symbol of loneliness. They shared stories, laughter, and quiet glances filled with unspoken feelings. When the night grew late, Victor sat at his piano once more. But this time, Clara sat beside him. As his fingers pressed the keys, the melody was no longer heavy with sorrow. It was light, full of hope, full of something he had long forgotten, love. The man who once lived in solitude, trapped by betrayal, had finally made his choice. And that choice changed everything. The empire he had built was no longer a prison. It was a home. A home with Clara Evans, the woman who had awakened his heart after decades of silence. Victor Hale was no longer just a billionaire CEO. He was a man who had found love again. And this time, he knew, it was real.